This thing. This is the latest project. If you've seen my other video or videos, I don't know how the hell many I'm gonna end up making out of this thing. Just got it dragged in here and put my starter rod on here. It's in neutral. This damn thing is seized up too. So that last cub I worked on was seized up, and I had to pull the freaking head off of it after it had been soaking in PB Blaster for months and beat the piston down. Well, I ain't waiting months. So I guess first thing I ought to do is pull the head off this son of a bitch and see what them cylinders look like. So to do that, I guess, hell, I don't know. Take off the valve cover, apparently. I'm going to leave the exhaust manifold bolted on. Of course, the carburetor's already missing, so looks like this water pipe has got to come off of there. Plug wires, of course. Hopefully it won't be too bad to get that head off, and I hope like hell it ain't going to be bad to get it unseized, because this thing is already a big enough project. You know, it's like everywhere I look there's something wrong with it. It's already a big enough project to want to make me part the damn thing out. I guess let's get elbow deep in grease and shit. Well, here's what it looks like under the valve cover. Everything's pitted. I mean, it looks like it's been sitting out for 20 years. I don't know if any of this shit's loose or... I mean, I would hate to have to adjust these fucking lifters. I don't know if a guy could. I'm going to tap around on these valves and see how bad they're seized in there. I guess just... this thing's been sitting in the barn for... Been sitting in that barn, in that same spot for... I don't know, 8 years or so. I'm gonna guess around that. I don't know what it looked like before, you know, he parked it there. He swore up and down this tractor was running. So, this is bad. This is really bad. We'll keep on keeping on. Well, what you see here is the cylinders and sawdust. See all that sawdust and shit? You think, how in the world is the sawdust in there? How did sawdust... Well, remember the water pipe was open? So critters were able to get down in the water pipe, into the head. All these water passages are full of sawdust and shit. So that's not what's seizing it up. It's just seized up. But... you know, you get to deal with critters, I guess, if, you know, you leave it exposed to them. So that's exactly what happened here. I mean, they were crawling in and out that hole, dragging sawdust in. So there's mice living in the head and got sawdust all throughout all the water passages and stuff. So that's going to have to be cleaned up too. You can see I got PB Blaster in there. I squirted that in very first thing, pulled out spark plug, squirted PB Blaster in there. Got my trusty block of wood and a hammer, and I'm going to tap around on it and see if I can get this thing to move. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. So what I did was I was feeling around just with my finger running up and down on the walls on these cylinders. This one, and this one felt reasonably smooth. This one feels rough, so I figure this is my problem cylinder, or more than the others. So it must have had a valve open, you know, could have been intake, could have been exhaust, it doesn't really matter, they're both exposed, you know, there's no carburetor on there, so, air was getting into that cylinder and causing it to rust up, and like I say, the wall of it's kind of rough, so I took my block of wood, and it's just a chunk of 2x3, I think, or whatever the hell that is, just, you know, scrap wood I got laying around, and hammer, and just gently tapped it down. And now I can feel about an inch from the bottom. I've tapped it almost all the way down. I don't want to put too much stress on the main bearings and you know, crankshaft journals and bearings and connecting rods and shit. I don't want to keep beating any more than I have to. So I made myself enough room to work. I got it down there where about now I can feel about the bottom 1 inch of the cylinder is smooth. So this upper portion, 2 or 3 inches is going to have to be, I'm going to take my Harbor Freight Special, little 2-inch or 1.5-inch wire brush on a drill, and I'm going to clean it up very gently. And then I'm going to take 3-stone hone. Same thing I did. If you've seen my Cub videos, this is the same thing I'm doing with this one that I did with that Cub. I'm going to take that hone and clean up them cylinder walls. So it's free. It ain't seized up no more, so that's a big thing. All right, guys, so big news here. That slapping noise is actually the crank in here. Oil pump's working. You see the oil squirting up there. Cylinders are moving, pistons are moving good. Cylinders feel good. I took a file to the top of the block and the head here. Just, work a file back and forth, all different angles. Make sure you ain't got no nicks or burrs or nothing. Took a wire brush to this head gasket. Head gasket actually looked pretty good, so we're going to reuse the head gasket. I'm going to go ahead and mount the head back up. I'm going to look up the torque spec, and I'll let you know what that is after I do it. So I took a vacuum, stuck a shop vac on this end, and I stuck my air gun in, and I blew out all these ports and sucked out all the shit out of there. I did the same thing on the block. Took my air gun, stuck it in all the water jacket ports, and stuck the shop vac down there on a lower water pipe. So I think I got all the shit out of it from the mice nest and hickory nuts and everything that was living in there. So should be in good shape now. All right, so I got the head on there. There's a couple of different torque specs online, and there's a lot of conversation about which one to go by, and some's for metal gaskets, some's for asbestos gaskets. It's either 65 or 80 foot-pounds, so I went ahead and torqued the head to 80 foot-pounds. I did it in 4 stages. I did 20, 40, 60, then 80. So, and how I torqued them was, I started in the center here. There's one kind of hiding under the rocker assembly. Started here, then went up and did over, then that one, then that one, then that one. So you kind of work from the center out as you go. So 20, then 40, then 60, then 80. So we got the head on there, the rocker assembly. The only torque spec I could find was a general for that size of bolt, and it was 35 foot-pounds, so that's what I torqued the rockers. And you got 1, 2, 3 bolts there for that. The crank, I was cranking it, and I was kind of checking the valve clearances on here, and some of them seem a little snug, but there's so much corrosion and shit. I mean, I cleaned up the little sockets on the bottom of the rockers, and I cleaned up the rods, so should be a pretty good amount of contact in there. Shouldn't be too much allowance for slop and dirt and shit. It don't look like much, but this thing it cleaned up considerably. I mean, you couldn't even make out the nuts, the shape of the nuts on the adjusters there. So it did clean up considerably. But so I was cranking it by hand, and I thought, well, I'll work it over a bunch of times and see if I can kind of work the shit out of it, oil everything up real good, then check the valve clearances. And it's supposed to be, the final valve clearance on these is supposed to be 14 thousandths when the engine is hot. So I'll have to run the engine, pull off the valve cover, and then check everything while it's warm. But to get me a starting point, I figure 14 thousandths is the hot, when everything's expanded. Maybe if I do, maybe if I set them now just real roughly at 25, that should allow for a tremendous amount of expansion. Should be a safe number still. So I don't want them too tight. I'd rather have them just a bit loose. So to do that, rather than cranking it over, lubing everything up and keep hand cranking it, I thought, well, I'll just stick the starter in. Well, so that starter leads to, well, now I got to jack around with wiring. I got to create a couple of cables, clean up a ground spot. So that's what I'm working on now. Just coming up with some wiring to get that starter to work. If you saw my other videos on the Cub, this is the exact same starter switch. Don't mind that band sticking up there. This is the exact same starter contact that the Farmall Cub takes. So it's an $8 switch online. It's $15 at Tractor Supply. I'm going to have to pick one up somewhere. But that switch bolts on with that screw and that screw back there, and it makes contact here. And then it's got a little push button with a rocker that rides a rod up to the dash up here. In the meantime, until I get that switch, I'm just going to take battery, put the cable on the battery, take the end of the wire and tap it on that contact point. And I mean, I can tap bare wire on that contact point and that'll make that starter turn. So that's what I'm doing for now. Just trying to get that engine rotate over so that I can adjust the valve clearance, get a rough adjustment on that just to be safe, and then we'll continue on with other stuff. All right, so you can see I got the valve cover back on. They weren't too bad. There was only a couple of them that were tight, the rockers that is, and most of them were running around 20 or 25 anyhow. So I just loosened up the couple tight ones and called it good. I got my starter bolted in there. I have made sense of what's going on with the wiring here. It don't show up real well, but there's two wires that come to one here, go up to the resistor, then go to the coil. So I pretty well made sense of what's going on with the wiring here. I did have to take apart the push-pull switch. The contacts were dirty on it, so the switch wasn't functioning. So I pretty well got the wiring to where the tractor should run. And I still need my starter switch. I went ahead and I don't know why the hell the hydraulic lines were off of here. The only thing I could think was maybe the hydraulic line. The hydraulic line was kind of in the way to loosen this starter bolt. I mean, there's not a lot of throw for your wrench. The only thing I could think was somebody loosened up these hydraulic lines to make room for that starter bolt. Well, the hydraulic lines are kind of bent and warped, and somebody's done some brazing down here. I roughly tested it with soap water and stick an air hose in and pressurized the lines. It appears that the brazes are holding. Had to round up some nuts and bolts down there, clean that up. That surface was not very square on the line side, so took a file to that, did kind of a rough mill job, I guess, or same thing up here. This surface of this plate was not real true. Had to come up with had to cut a new gasket for that, so that's a tricky little thing. There's 3 bolt holes you got to cut, then there's the 2 hydraulic holes, and then there's a slot. Yeah, that's a weird deal there. There's the old one. So when I scraped that off, I was very careful not to destroy the gasket. So, because that's an oddball there. So that was hard to cut out. But anyhow, I was able to use that as a template to cut a new gasket. Hollow punch set, guys. If you ain't cutting your own gaskets, you're spending way too much money on gaskets. You can buy gasket material for $6 a roll, 3 foot long at Napa, and that'll last you for a while. But hollow punch set for maybe $15 at Family Farm and Home or Tractor Supply, or Harbor Freight's probably got them. So they'll pay for themselves in just a few gaskets. It's a big deal. I got the water pump, or not the water pump. There is no water pump on this old engine. It's a thermo siphon, I think, is the trade name that IH come up with. They call it, I think they call it thermo siphon. Anyhow, some word that they made up, but essentially the water just circulates due to the heat of the engine. But I had to cut a new gasket back here. I cut a new gasket. That took a bunch. I cut this out of cork just because this is kind of flimsy. There's only 2 bolts holding it, so I wanted it to, have a little bit of flex, a little thickness to that gasket. This here I cut out of fiber. This down here has got O-rings. This over here was a fiber gasket that I cut there. So, like I say, I pretty well got the wiring figured out. I am getting spark. I pulled out the number 4 spark plug, laid it up here, and energized the coil. And essentially, all you got to do is run a hot wire to the coil. And if you crank it, I mean, you can do nothing but put a hot wire to the coil. And as long as the negative side of the coil on a 12-volt system, as long as the negative side of the coil is going to the distributor, and you can just run this straight to the battery, the hot wire, and crank it by hand if you had to, and it will make a spark then. So anyhow, I cranked it with a starter, and it number 4's sparking, so I went ahead and stuck all the spark plugs back in there. So I'm going to assume that if one of them is making fire, they should all be. I guess I'm kind of to the point where I'm going to be doing some linkages now. This throttle linkage, it's disconnected up here, so I don't know. I'm gonna have to hunt for a rod. There might be a rod in a pile of parts over there, or I may end up having to fabricate. Or no, let's see. This linkage goes across to that, and there should be a rod from here to the carburetor. So maybe carburetor will be my next thing, and then I can work backwards to fabricate a linkage. So I'm gonna have to round up a carburetor. There is one in the pile of parts over there. It may or may not be good. And we're going to need a gas tank. The gas tank has a hole in it, so I'm going to have to braze that. This seam here, you can see it's got rust all along it. That seam's going to have to be brazed, so that shouldn't be no big deal. And hopefully the radiator's good, so maybe we'll, I don't know, maybe we'll pressure test that a little bit. Just stick an air hose in it, plug to one side, and spray soap water all over it and make sure it's holding. So those are the things I'll be working on next, I guess.